Zethkar's investigation took a darker turn when he began studying what humans called their special forces. Through careful observation, he had identified certain human military units that operated differently from standard formations. These smaller groups undertook missions that seemed designed specifically to test the limits of survival. He watched a team of 12 humans infiltrate enemy territory for what appeared to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Standard galactic protocol would involve automated drones or long-range sensors for such operations. Sending living beings into hostile territory for information gathering was considered wasteful and inefficient. The human team traveled on foot across 200 kilometers of enemy-controlled terrain. They carried minimal supplies, no backup communication systems, and no extraction plan. When discovered by enemy forces, instead of immediately withdrawing to preserve intelligence value, they fought a running battle for 6 days. What happened next defied every principle of military logic Zethkar understood. With half their team dead or wounded, surrounded by superior numbers, the humans called in artillery fire on their own position. They deliberately targeted themselves to eliminate the enemy force that had cornered them. 3 humans survived the bombardment by taking shelter in a drainage system. Instead of attempting escape, they continued their original mission. For 2 weeks, these 3 humans remained in enemy territory, gathering intelligence while slowly dying from untreated wounds and exposure. They transmitted their findings only when certain they couldn't survive to deliver the information personally. When rescue forces finally reached their position, they found 2 bodies and 1 human barely alive, still trying to complete mission objectives. The intelligence gathered resulted in a successful operation that eliminated a key enemy stronghold. From a strategic perspective, the mission was successful. From any rational analysis of resource expenditure, it was catastrophically inefficient. No galactic military would sacrifice trained special operations personnel for intelligence that could be gathered through less costly means. Zethkar began focusing his observations on these elite human units. What he discovered challenged his understanding of biological limitations. Human special forces routinely operated in environments that should have killed them. They functioned without sleep for periods that exceeded what Zethkar's medical databases indicated was possible for their species. They continued combat operations while suffering injuries that should have rendered them unconscious. During one observation, he watched a human special forces operator continue a hostage rescue mission with a projectile wound that had severed major blood vessels. The human remained conscious and effective for over an hour, while literally bleeding to death. He completed the mission, secured civilian safety, and eliminated all hostile targets before collapsing. Medical analysis indicated he should have lost consciousness within minutes of the injury. The rescue operation saved 43 civilians. By any measure, it was a success, but the cost-benefit analysis made no sense. The human operator possessed years of specialized training, irreplaceable combat experience, and genetic factors that had qualified him for elite status. Trading such a valuable resource for civilians with no military capability violated every principle of strategic resource management. Yet this wasn't an isolated incident. Zethkar documented hundreds of similar cases where human special forces traded their lives for minimal tactical advantage. What troubled him most was that these decisions weren't made by command authority. Individual humans made these choices independently, without orders or authorization. This pattern led him to investigate human military leadership structures. Most galactic species maintained strict hierarchical command systems where individual initiative was discouraged. Strategic decisions were made by specialized command personnel using advanced analytical systems. Individual soldiers were expected to follow orders while preserving their capability for future operations. Human military structure was completely different. Individual soldiers at the lowest levels were expected to make independent strategic decisions. They were trained to assume command if their superiors were eliminated. Most shocking of all, they were explicitly instructed to ignore orders if they believed circumstances required different action. Zethkar observed a human infantry unit that lost contact with command during a complex urban operation. Instead of withdrawing to re-establish communication, they continued the mission based on their last known objectives. When those objectives became impossible due to changed circumstances, they independently identified new targets and modified their mission parameters. This level of individual initiative was unprecedented in galactic military history. Most species required constant command oversight to maintain unit cohesion and prevent tactical errors. Humans appeared to function more effectively when command oversight was eliminated. Their combat effectiveness actually increased when they were forced to operate independently. The implications were staggering. Human military forces could continue operations even after command structure was completely eliminated. They could adapt to changing circumstances without central coordination. Each individual soldier represented not just a combat unit, but a potential command element capable of independent strategic thinking. Zethkar's reports were becoming increasingly urgent, but the Council seemed more interested in human technological capabilities than their tactical doctrine. They wanted specifications on human weapon systems, analysis of their industrial capacity, assessment of their spaceflight potential. They were missing the true significance of what he was observing. Human technology was indeed primitive by galactic standards, but their military effectiveness wasn't based on technological superiority. It was based on something far more dangerous: complete psychological commitment to mission success regardless of personal cost. He decided to observe human training procedures, hoping to understand how their military indoctrinated soldiers with such extreme dedication. What he found was even more disturbing. The training wasn't creating artificial psychological conditioning. It was simply refining natural human behavioral patterns. Human children played games that simulated combat scenarios. Their entertainment media celebrated individuals who sacrificed themselves for group benefit. Their religious and philosophical systems emphasized concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice that prioritized group survival over individual preservation. This wasn't military conditioning. This was species-wide cultural programming that had evolved over thousands of years. Humans weren't trained to fight with suicidal intensity. They were naturally inclined toward such behavior. Zethkar began studying human evolutionary history, searching for explanations. What he discovered changed his entire understanding of the species. Humans had evolved on a planet with extreme environmental pressures. They had faced extinction-level events multiple times throughout their development. They had survived by developing psychological mechanisms that prioritize species, survival over individual safety. Every other intelligent species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds with relatively stable environments. They had developed cooperation-based societies that emphasized preservation of individuals for the benefit of the group. Humans had developed the opposite: sacrifice-based societies that emphasized elimination of individuals for the benefit of the group. This fundamental difference explained everything he had observed. Human warfare wasn't aberrant behavior. It was evolutionary adaptation applied to military conflict. They fought with complete commitment because their survival instincts demanded it. They couldn't conceive of warfare as a limited political tool because their psychology didn't include self-preservation limitations. The realization terrified him. The Galactic Council was considering membership for a species that had evolved to fight without rational constraints. Every war in galactic history had been limited by mutual understanding that excessive casualties would damage both sides. Humans had no such limitations. They were psychologically capable of accepting any level of casualties necessary to achieve their objectives. Zethkar began drafting a final report that would recommend immediate quarantine of the human system. But before he could transmit it, something happened that made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about human nature. Zethkar's investigation took a darker turn when he began studying what humans called their special forces. Through careful observation, he had identified certain human military units that operated differently from standard formations. These smaller groups undertook missions that seemed designed specifically to test the limits of survival. Watched a team of 12 humans infiltrate enemy territory for what appeared to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Standard galactic protocol would involve automated drones or long-range sensors for such operations. Sending living beings into hostile territory for information gathering was considered wasteful and inefficient. The human team traveled on foot across 200 kilometers of enemy-controlled terrain. They carried minimal supplies, no backup communication systems, and no extraction plan. When discovered by enemy forces, instead of immediately withdrawing to preserve intelligence value, they fought a running battle for 6 days. What happened next defied every principle of military logic Zethkar understood. With half their team dead or wounded, Surrounded by superior numbers, the humans called in artillery fire on their own position. They deliberately targeted themselves to eliminate the enemy force that had cornered them. 3 humans survived the bombardment by taking shelter in a drainage system. Instead of attempting escape, they continued their original mission. For 2 weeks, these 3 humans remained in enemy territory, gathering intelligence while slowly dying from untreated wounds and exposure. They transmitted their findings only when certain they couldn't survive to deliver the information personally. When rescue forces finally reached their position, they found 2 bodies and 1 human barely alive, still trying to complete mission objectives. The intelligence gathered resulted in a successful operation that eliminated a key enemy stronghold. From a strategic perspective, the mission was successful. From any rational analysis of resource expenditure, it was catastrophically inefficient. No galactic military would sacrifice trained special operations personnel for intelligence that could be gathered through less costly means. Zethkar began focusing his observations on these elite human units. What he discovered challenged his understanding of biological limitations. Human special forces routinely operated in environments that should have killed them. They functioned without sleep for periods that exceeded what Zethkar's medical databases indicated was possible for their species. They continued combat operations while suffering injuries that should have rendered them unconscious. During one observation, he watched a human special forces operator continue a hostage rescue mission with a projectile wound that had severed major blood vessels. The human remained conscious and effective for over an hour, while literally bleeding to death. He completed the mission, secured civilian safety, and eliminated all hostile targets before collapsing. Medical analysis indicated he should have lost consciousness within minutes of the injury. The rescue operation saved 43 civilians. By any measure, it was a success, but the cost-benefit analysis made no sense. The human operator possessed years of specialized training, irreplaceable combat experience, and genetic factors that had qualified him for elite status. Trading such a valuable resource for civilians with no military capability violated every principle of strategic resource management. Yet this wasn't an isolated incident. Zethkar documented hundreds of similar cases where human special forces traded their lives for minimal tactical advantage. What troubled him most was that these decisions weren't made by command authority. Individual humans made these choices independently, without orders or authorization. This pattern led him to investigate human military leadership structures. Most galactic species maintained strict hierarchical command systems, where individual initiative was discouraged. Strategic decisions were made by specialized command personnel, using advanced analytical systems. Individual soldiers were expected to follow orders while preserving their capability for future operations. Human military structure was completely different. Individual soldiers at the lowest levels were expected to make independent strategic decisions. They were trained to assume command if their superiors were eliminated. Most shocking of all, they were explicitly instructed to ignore orders if they believed circumstances required different action. Zethkar observed a human infantry unit that lost contact with command during a complex urban operation. Instead of withdrawing to re-establish communication, they continued the mission based on their last known objectives. When those objectives became impossible due to changed circumstances, they independently identified new targets and modified their mission parameters. This level of individual initiative was unprecedented in galactic military history. Most species required constant command oversight to maintain unit cohesion and prevent tactical errors. Humans appeared to function more effectively when command oversight was eliminated. Their combat effectiveness actually increased when they were forced to operate independently. The implications were staggering. Human military forces could continue operations even after command structure was completely eliminated. They could adapt to changing circumstances without central coordination. Each individual soldier represented not just a combat unit, but a potential command element capable of independent strategic thinking. Zethkar's reports were becoming increasingly urgent, but the Council seemed more interested in human technological capabilities than their tactical doctrine. They wanted specifications on human weapons systems, analysis of their industrial capacity, assessment of their space flight potential. They were missing the true significance of what he was observing. Human technology was indeed primitive by galactic standards, but their military effectiveness wasn't based on technological superiority. It was based on something far more dangerous: complete psychological commitment to mission success regardless of personal cost. He decided to observe human training procedures, hoping to understand how their military indoctrinated soldiers with such extreme dedication. What he found was even more disturbing. The training wasn't creating artificial psychological conditioning. It was simply refining natural human behavioral patterns. Human children played games that simulated combat scenarios. Their entertainment media celebrated individuals who sacrificed themselves for group benefit. Their religious and philosophical systems emphasized concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice that prioritized group survival over individual preservation. This wasn't military conditioning. This was species-wide cultural programming that had evolved over thousands of years. Humans weren't trained to fight with suicidal intensity. They were naturally inclined toward such behavior. Zethkar began studying human evolutionary history, searching for explanations. What he discovered changed his entire understanding of the species. Humans had evolved on a planet with extreme environmental pressures. They had faced extinction-level events multiple times throughout their development. They had survived by developing psychological mechanisms that prioritized species survival over individual safety. Every other intelligent species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds with relatively stable environments. They had developed cooperation-based societies that emphasized preservation of individuals for the benefit of the group. Humans had developed the opposite: sacrifice-based societies that emphasized elimination of individuals for the benefit of the group. This fundamental difference explained everything he had observed. Human warfare wasn't aberrant behavior. It was evolutionary adaptation applied to military conflict. They fought with complete commitment because their survival instincts demanded it. They couldn't conceive of warfare as a limited political tool because their psychology didn't include self-preservation limitations. The realization terrified him. The Galactic Council was considering membership for a species that had evolved to fight without rational constraints. Every war in galactic history had been limited by mutual understanding that excessive casualties would damage both sides. Humans had no such limitations. They were psychologically capable of accepting any level of casualties necessary to achieve their objectives. Zethkar began drafting a final report that would recommend immediate quarantine of the human system. But before he could transmit it, something happened that made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about human nature. The event that changed Zethkar's perspective happened during what humans called a natural disaster. A massive seismic event struck a densely populated human city while he was conducting routine observations. The earthquake measured 8.2 on their scale, causing widespread structural collapse and trapping thousands of civilians beneath rubble. Standard galactic protocol for such disasters involved immediate evacuation of surviving populations to prevent further casualties. Resources would be focused on relocating survivors rather than attempting rescue operations in unstable structures. The mathematical analysis was simple. More lives could be saved by accepting the loss of trapped individuals and protecting those who could be safely evacuated. Humans responded differently. Within hours of the earthquake, thousands of human civilians converged on the disaster zone. They weren't fleeing the area, they were entering it. Despite aftershocks that continued to bring down weakened buildings, these humans began digging through rubble with their bare hands. They crawled into collapsed structures that could collapse further at any moment. Zethkar watched a human rescue worker spend 14 hours digging through concrete debris to reach a trapped child. The building had been declared structurally unsound by engineering teams. Every aftershock threatened complete collapse. The rescue worker was repeatedly ordered to evacuate for his own safety. He ignored these orders and continued digging. When mechanical equipment became available, the worker refused to leave his position. He remained in the collapse zone, directing machinery while standing in the path of potential structural failure. When they finally reached the trapped child, the worker carried her to safety through a building that was actively collapsing around them. The child survived. The rescue worker was crushed by falling debris during the evacuation. From any rational analysis, the operation was a failure. They had traded a trained adult with specialized rescue skills for a child with no particular capabilities. Yet other human rescue workers treated this as a success story. This pattern repeated throughout the disaster. Humans consistently risked valuable trained personnel to save civilians, who contributed nothing to their military or economic capacity. Firefighters entered burning buildings to rescue pets. Police officers remained at dangerous posts to direct evacuations instead of fleeing to safety. Medical personnel worked in unstable facilities rather than evacuating to secure areas. Most puzzling were the volunteer civilians. People with no training or equipment traveled from hundreds of kilometers away to assist in rescue operations. They worked without pay, without recognition, often without any coordination with official rescue services. Many died in secondary collapses or fires while attempting to help complete strangers. Zethkar's analysis showed that the human disaster response actually increased total casualties. More people died during rescue operations than would have been lost if they had simply evacuated survivors and left the trapped individuals. Yet humans considered their response successful because they had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. This altruistic behavior directly contradicted everything he had observed about human warfare. The same species that fought with ruthless intensity showed completely irrational concern for individual welfare during disasters. They would sacrifice military personnel for minimal tactical advantage, but risk multiple trained rescue workers to save a single civilian. The contradiction forced him to examine his earlier observations more carefully. He began reviewing footage of human combat operations, looking for patterns he might have missed. What he discovered changed his understanding of human nature entirely. Human military ferocity wasn't driven by aggression or bloodlust. It was driven by protective instinct. Every example of seemingly suicidal combat behavior occurred when humans were defending something they valued. The soldiers who fought impossible odds were protecting their homes, their families, their communities, or their comrades. When humans charged into certain death, they weren't seeking violence, they were preventing greater harm to others. The Special Forces operative who bled to death during the hostage rescue hadn't been pursuing military glory. He had been protecting innocent civilians. The infantry unit that held an impossible position hadn't been following orders. They had been buying time for civilian evacuation. This realization recontextualized every human conflict he had observed. What appeared to be irrational military aggression was actually protective behavior taken to extreme lengths. Humans didn't fight because they enjoyed warfare, they fought because they were psychologically incapable of allowing harm to come to those they protected. The evolutionary pressure that had shaped human psychology became clear. They had survived as a species not through individual superiority, but through collective sacrifice. Their willingness to die for others wasn't a military adaptation. It was the fundamental survival strategy that had allowed their species to thrive in a hostile environment. Zethkar began studying human history with this new understanding. Every major conflict showed the same pattern. Humans fought most effectively when protecting something, not when pursuing conquest. Their greatest military victories occurred when they were defending their homes or allies. Their most devastating defeats happened when they were fighting for abstract political goals without clear protective purpose. This protective instinct extended beyond their own species. Zethkar found records of humans risking their lives to save domestic animals during disasters. They had even established organizations dedicated to protecting plant and animal species that provided no economic benefit. Some humans devoted their entire lives to preserving creatures that most galactic species would consider irrelevant. The scope of human protective instinct was unprecedented. They felt responsibility not just for their immediate families or communities, but for their entire species, their planet's ecosystem, and even abstract concepts like justice and freedom. This psychological trait that made them terrifying in warfare also made them uniquely suited for protecting others. For the first time since beginning his observations, Zethkar considered what human membership might bring to the Galactic Council beyond military capability. Every galactic species pursued their own interests first, cooperating with others only when mutually beneficial. Humans appeared psychologically incapable of such limited cooperation. Their protective instincts would extend to any species they considered part of their group. He began researching human interactions with other Earth species to test this theory. What he found supported his hypothesis. Humans had domesticated hundreds of species, not for economic benefit but for companionship. They provided medical care for animals that could never reciprocate. They had established vast preserves to protect species that were economically useless. Most remarkably, humans fought wars to protect other humans they had never met. Their history included conflicts where one human population fought to defend another population that shared no genetic, cultural, or economic connections. They had died to protect complete strangers simply because those strangers needed protection. This behavior was psychologically impossible for most galactic species. Individual self-interest was too strong to permit such sacrifice for unrelated entities. Even species with strong social bonds limited their protective behavior to genetic relatives or immediate community members. Humans extended protective behavior to anything they perceived as needing protection, regardless of relationship or potential benefit. This trait that made them deadly enemies could also make them invaluable allies. Zethkar realized his mission had expanded beyond simple military assessment. He needed to understand whether human protective instincts could be directed toward galactic civilization as a whole. If humans could psychologically adopt other species as part of their protective group, they would represent not a threat to galactic peace, but its ultimate guardians. The test of this theory would come sooner than he expected. His long-range sensors detected something approaching the human system that would challenge everything humans claimed to believe about protecting others. The approaching ship registered on Zethkar's sensors as a Keldan slave vessel. The Keldans operated outside galactic law, raiding primitive worlds for slave labor to sell in frontier systems. Officially, the Galactic Council condemned such activities. Unofficially, they ignored raiders who targeted pre-spaceflight civilizations, considering such species outside Council jurisdiction. The ship was massive, a kilometer-long converted cargo hauler equipped with stasis pods for transporting captured populations. Zethkar's analysis indicated it could hold approximately 50,000 humans in suspended animation. The Keldans had obviously detected Earth's electromagnetic signatures and identified it as a target rich in primitive sentience. Standard protocol required Zethkar to maintain observation distance and document the encounter. The Galactic Council would want detailed information about how humans responded to first contact with hostile aliens. Previous civilizations had typically attempted negotiation or immediate surrender. When faced with obviously superior technology, the Keldan ship established orbit and began transmitting standard subjugation demands in multiple Earth languages. They offered three options: complete surrender and voluntary enslavement, resistance followed by forced enslavement, or planetary sterilization, followed by automated harvesting of any survivors. Zethkar monitored human communication networks as the messages were received. Initial reactions followed predictable patterns: panic, confusion, attempts to verify the authenticity of the transmissions. Several human governments tried to establish diplomatic contact, requesting negotiations and attempting to understand Keldan demands. The Keldan response was swift and educational. They selected a human city with approximately 2 million inhabitants and demonstrated their orbital bombardment capabilities. The energy blast completely vaporized the urban center, leaving a circular crater where the city had existed. The message was clear: resistance would result in systematic elimination of human population centers until compliance was achieved. What happened next shocked both Zethkar and the Keldans. Instead of triggering mass surrender, the demonstration attack unified human resistance. Every human government simultaneously rejected Keldan demands. Military forces worldwide began mobilizing for combat operations. Most surprisingly, civilian populations began preparing for ground combat despite having no weapons capable of affecting orbital targets. The Keldans had miscalculated badly. Their demonstration was intended to terrify humans into submission by showing the futility of resistance. Instead, it activated the same protective instincts Zethkar had observed during human disasters. The attack hadn't intimidated humans. It had transformed them into guardians of their species. Human military response began with every nuclear weapon on their planet. Hundreds of primitive fusion warheads launched simultaneously toward the Keldan ship. The weapons were too slow to threaten an alert target, but they demonstrated human commitment to resistance despite impossible odds. The Keldans easily intercepted the missiles with point defense systems. They responded with targeted strikes against human military installations, expecting quick capitulation once organized resistance was eliminated. They destroyed naval bases, airfields, command centers, and missile silos in a coordinated bombardment that lasted 6 hours. When the bombardment ended, human military capability should have been eliminated. Instead, resistance increased. Human civilians began attacking Keldon landing craft with improvised weapons. Farmers used agricultural equipment to assault alien soldiers armed with energy weapons. Urban dwellers created explosive devices from commercial chemicals and attacked Keldon supply convoys. Children too young for military service served as communications relays and intelligence gatherers. The scope of human resistance defied every precedent in Keldon experience. Most species offered token resistance before accepting inevitable defeat. Humans fought as if victory was possible despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Zethkar watched a human grandmother attach improvised explosives to her body and detonate them while surrounded by Keldon soldiers. The tactical effect was minimal. She killed 3 Keldons while accomplishing no strategic objective. But her action inspired dozens of similar attacks across the planet. The psychological impact on Keldon forces was devastating. They were accustomed to terrorizing helpless populations into submission. Facing opponents who responded to terror with increased resistance was outside their training and experience. More disturbing were human tactics that seemed designed specifically to maximize Keldon casualties regardless of strategic value. Humans poisoned their own water supplies to kill Keldon soldiers who consumed them. They destroyed their own infrastructure to prevent Keldon use. They contaminated their own food stores with biological agents lethal to Keldon physiology. Within 2 weeks, the Keldons faced a situation unprecedented in their raiding history. Instead of cowing a primitive population into submission, they were fighting a planet-wide guerrilla war against opponents who seemed psychologically incapable of surrender. The human response wasn't random or emotional. Zethkar's analysis revealed sophisticated coordination, despite the destruction of centralized command structures. Human resistance cells were sharing intelligence, coordinating operations and adapting tactics based on observed Keldon weaknesses. Most impressive was their rapid technological adaptation. Within days of first contact, humans had developed countermeasures for Keldon energy weapons using principles from their own technology. They created electromagnetic pulse devices that disabled Keldon equipment. They developed projectile weapons specifically designed to penetrate Keldon armor. The improvised human weapons were crude but effective. More importantly, they were produced in massive quantities using distributed manufacturing that was almost impossible to eliminate through orbital bombardment. Every human settlement became a weapons production facility. Keldon casualties mounted steadily. Their superior technology provided tactical advantages, but couldn't overcome the strategic reality of fighting an entire planet whose population refused to accept defeat. Every Keldon soldier eliminated was irreplaceable. Every human killed was immediately replaced by multiple volunteers. The mathematics were simple and devastating. The Keldons had approximately 10,000 soldiers aboard their ship. Earth had over 7 billion humans, millions of whom were actively participating in resistance operations. Even with massive technological superiority, the numbers didn't support long-term Keldon success. After 3 weeks of ground combat, the Keldon commander made a decision that revealed their complete misunderstanding of human psychology. He announced that continued resistance would result in complete planetary sterilization. All human life would be eliminated rather than continuing to accept casualties from impossible resistance. The human response was immediate and unified. Instead of surrendering to save their species, they increased resistance operations. Parents sent their children to hidden bunkers, not to preserve them for post-war survival, but to ensure continued resistance after adult populations were eliminated. Zethkar realized he was witnessing something beyond military conflict. This was a species-wide commitment to resistance that transcended individual survival instincts. Humans were willing to accept extinction rather than submit to enslavement. The Keldons began systematic sterilization bombardment, targeting major population centers. Billions of humans died in the first day of the assault, yet resistance continued. Survivors emerged from rubble to attack Keldon forces. Children as young as 10 participated in combat operations. Elderly humans too frail for direct combat provided intelligence and support for active fighters. Even as their civilization crumbled around them, humans maintained organized resistance. They fought not because they believed they could win, but because surrender was psychologically impossible for their species. Zethkar found himself faced with a terrible choice. Galactic Council protocols forbade interference in pre-spaceflight civilizations, but what he was witnessing represented something unique in galactic history, a species choosing extinction over submission. The loss of such a remarkable civilization would diminish the entire galaxy. Zethkar faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Council regulations were absolute. No interference with pre-spaceflight civilizations under any circumstances. Violation would result in court-martial, imprisonment, and permanent exile from galactic civilization. Yet watching humanity face extinction while maintaining impossible resistance challenged every principle he had developed during his long military service. The Keldon sterilization bombardment entered its third day. Conservative estimates suggested human population had been reduced by 40%. Major cities were ash. Industrial capacity was nearly eliminated. Agricultural regions were contaminated wastelands. By every rational measure, human civilization was ending. Yet resistance continued with undiminished intensity. Zethkar monitored communications between surviving human groups. Instead of despair or surrender negotiations, the messages contained tactical updates, resource allocation discussions, and coordination for continued operations. Humans were treating the extermination of their species as a temporary setback, requiring tactical adjustment. A message from a human leader in what had been North America crystallized the situation. We cannot win this war in any conventional sense. Our planet is dying, our people are dying, and our civilization is ending. But we can ensure these alien bastards pay such a price that no other raiders will ever target a defenseless world again. Every one of them we kill here saves unknown billions elsewhere. The strategic thinking was breathtaking in its scope. Humans weren't fighting for their own survival. They were fighting to protect species they had never met on worlds they would never see. Their resistance had evolved beyond self-defense into active protection of galactic civilization itself. This realization forced Zethkar to consider the broader implications. The Keldons weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a network of raiders that targeted primitive worlds throughout the galaxy. Their success on Earth would encourage similar operations elsewhere. Their failure might deter future raids entirely. From this perspective, human resistance served galactic security interests. Every Keldon ship destroyed above Earth was one less ship available for raids on other primitive worlds. Every Keldon soldier killed on Earth was one fewer raider threatening peaceful civilizations. Zethkar began reviewing Council regulations more carefully, searching for legal justification for intervention. Standard protocols prohibited interference with internal conflicts of pre-spaceflight civilizations. But this wasn't an internal conflict, it was an external attack by a hostile force operating outside Council authority. The regulations contained provisions for protecting primitive civilizations from external threats that exceeded their defensive capabilities. These provisions had never been invoked because most external threats involved other Council species operating under established diplomatic protocols. The Keldons represented something different, criminals operating outside any legal framework. More importantly, Zethkar's mission had been to evaluate human suitability for Council membership. The Keldon attack was directly interfering with that evaluation by threatening to eliminate the species before assessment could be completed. Intervention could be justified as protection of Council interests rather than humanitarian concern. The legal framework was thin, but it existed. Zethkar could intervene without technically violating Council protocols if he could demonstrate that Keldon operations threatened galactic security and that human resistance served Council interests. The evidence was overwhelming. Human resistance had already eliminated 30% of Keldon forces through primitive weapons and tactics. Their determination to fight regardless of odds had transformed a routine raiding operation into a costly military disaster. Other raider groups would certainly reconsider targeting primitive worlds if the Keldons were completely destroyed above Earth. Zethkar began preparing his ship for combat operations. His vessel was a state-of-the-art Council warship, designed for extended independent operations in hostile territory. Against a converted cargo hauler like the Keldon ship, the technological disparity was overwhelming. But first he needed to establish communication with human resistance forces. Any intervention needed to be coordinated with existing operations to maximize effectiveness and minimize additional human casualties. Finding communication channels proved surprisingly easy. Despite systematic destruction of their infrastructure, humans had maintained remarkably sophisticated communications networks. They had rapidly adapted civilian technology for military purposes, creating systems that were almost impossible to eliminate through orbital bombardment. Zethkar transmitted a carefully crafted message on frequencies he knew humans monitored. Human resistance forces. This is Commander Zethkar of the Galactic Defense Corps. I have been observing your conflict with Keldon raiders. Your resistance has demonstrated exceptional tactical effectiveness and serves broader galactic security interests. I am authorized to provide limited assistance in eliminating this threat. The response came within minutes, routed through multiple relay stations to prevent Keldon interception. Commander Zethkar, this is General Harrison, acting commander of Consolidated Human Resistance. We appreciate any assistance you can provide. Our primary objective is maximum damage to Keldon forces to deter future raids on defenseless worlds. Our own survival is secondary to this goal. The message confirmed Zethkar's assessment of human priorities. Even facing extinction, their strategic thinking focused on protecting others rather than saving themselves. This level of altruistic reasoning was unprecedented in galactic military history. Coordination proved remarkably efficient. Human intelligence networks had identified key weaknesses in Keldon ship systems and ground operations. Their understanding of enemy capabilities was impressively accurate, despite their technological limitations. More importantly, they had developed tactics specifically designed to maximize Keldon casualties while accepting devastating losses to their own forces. Zethkar realized that human resistance had already achieved the primary strategic objective. Keldon losses were approaching levels that would make the raid economically unfeasible, regardless of how many humans they captured. The raiders had spent more resources conquering Earth than they could ever recover through slave sales. Direct intervention would accelerate this process and ensure complete elimination of the Keldon threat. It would also demonstrate to other raider groups that primitive worlds weren't defenseless targets for exploitation. The attack plan was elegant in its simplicity. Human ground forces would coordinate simultaneous strikes against all Keldon installations planetside. Their attacks would force Keldon ships to lower their defensive shields for close air support operations. At that moment, Zethkar would engage with full weapon systems. The operation commenced at dawn across multiple time zones. Human resistance fighters emerged from hiding places that had somehow survived weeks of bombardment. They attacked with weapons ranging from sophisticated military hardware, salvaged from destroyed bases, to improvised devices created from household chemicals. The scope of coordination was staggering. Thousands of separate resistance cells launched simultaneous operations across 6 continents. Despite having no centralized command structure, the timing was perfect. Every Keldon installation faced attack within a 5-minute window. Keldon forces responded exactly as predicted. Their ground commanders called for immediate air support as human attacks overwhelmed defensive positions across the planet. The main ship descended to provide close support operations, lowering defensive shields to allow precision targeting of human positions. Zethkar struck the moment the Keldon shields dropped. His ship's primary weapon systems fired simultaneously. Plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, and electromagnetic pulse generators, all targeting critical ship systems. The technological disparity was so extreme that the engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. The Keldon ship's weapons were silenced first, preventing retaliation against human forces. Propulsion systems failed next, trapping the vessel in Earth's gravity well. Life support systems were carefully disabled to force crew evacuation, rather than total elimination. Zethkar wanted survivors to report back to other raider groups about the cost of targeting primitive worlds. Secondary explosions cascaded through the Keldon ship as emergency systems failed. The vessel broke apart during atmospheric entry, scattering debris across several continents. Escape pods ejected in all directions, carrying surviving Keldon crew members toward Earth's surface where human resistance forces waited. The psychological impact on surviving Keldans was exactly what Zethkar had hoped to achieve. They had expected to terrorize a helpless primitive world into submission. Instead, they faced opponents who fought with suicidal determination, backed by advanced galactic technology. The experience would be shared throughout raider networks, serving as a warning against future operations. Human casualties during the final operation were surprisingly light. Their tactical coordination had been so effective that most Keldan ground forces were eliminated before they could respond to the ship's destruction. More importantly, human resistance had achieved their primary objective: complete elimination of the raiding. 3 months after the Keldan raid, Zethkar found himself testifying before the full Galactic Council Assembly. His report on human military capabilities had created unprecedented debate among member species. Some viewed humans as essential additions to galactic defense forces. Others saw them as an existential threat to civilized society. The assembly chamber contained representatives from 47 different species, each with distinct evolutionary backgrounds and philosophical approaches to warfare. Zethkar had served with many of them during various conflicts throughout his career. None had prepared him for explaining human psychology to beings who couldn't comprehend fighting beyond rational self-interest. Council Speaker Velnash, a crystalline entity whose species communicated through harmonic vibrations, opened the session with traditional diplomatic protocol. Commander Zethkar, your preliminary reports suggest humans possess military capabilities that exceed established parameters for council membership evaluation. Please provide detailed analysis for assembly consideration. Zethkar activated his presentation systems, displaying footage from human conflicts he had observed. Honored Assembly, human military effectiveness stems not from technological superiority, but from psychological traits unprecedented in galactic civilization. They possess complete psychological commitment to objectives beyond individual survival. The first video showed human soldiers charging machine gun positions during one of their world wars. Gasps and harmonic distortions echoed through the chamber as representatives watched humans advance through gunfire that should have triggered immediate retreat responses. This behavior appears suicidal, observed Council Member Thrixon, whose insectoid species prized logical tactical analysis above all military virtues. No rational commander would order such attacks. No rational soldiers would obey such orders. Respected Thrixon, that assessment reflects the fundamental difference between human psychology and standard galactic norms. Humans don't evaluate military operations solely through survival probability calculations. They include factors like protection of others, preservation of principles, and prevention of greater harm to civilian populations. Zethkar displayed footage from the disaster response he had witnessed. Representatives watched humans risk their lives repeatedly to save individuals who contributed nothing to military or economic objectives. The reaction was immediate confusion from species who couldn't understand such behavior. Commander, interrupted Council Member Zarath, whose aquatic species was renowned for sophisticated strategic planning. This evidence suggests humans are mentally impaired. Their decision-making processes ignore basic survival optimization. How can such a species contribute to galactic defense? Honored Zarath, I initially shared that assessment. However, subsequent observations revealed that human protective instincts extend beyond their own species. They fight most effectively when protecting others, including beings they have never met. The presentation shifted to footage from the Keldan raid. Assembly members watched human resistance continue, despite overwhelming technological disadvantage and massive casualties. The coordination and tactical effectiveness were undeniable, but the psychological commitment defied comprehension. Their resistance eliminated 30% of Keldan forces using primitive weapons, Zethkar continued. More importantly, their strategic objective was deterring future raids on other primitive worlds, not saving their own civilization. They were willing to accept extinction to protect unknown species. Speaker Velnash's harmonic pattern shifted to indicate deep contemplation. Commander, you intervened in this conflict despite protocols prohibiting interference with pre-spaceflight civilizations. Please explain your reasoning. Honored Speaker, the Keldan raid represented a direct threat to galactic security and interfered with my evaluation mission. Human resistance was already achieving strategic objectives that served Council interests. My intervention accelerated those objectives while demonstrating to raider networks that primitive worlds aren't defenseless targets. The legal justification was accepted, but Zethkar could sense deeper concerns among assembly members. Several species had built their military doctrines around predictable enemy responses based on rational self-interest. Humans represented something outside those parameters, opponents who couldn't be deterred through conventional threat analysis. Council member Kethavar, whose militaristic species had dominated their region through superior firepower, voiced the concern directly. Commander, if humans cannot be deterred through standard threat assessment, how can they be controlled if they become hostile to Council interests? The question struck at the heart of galactic fears about human membership. Every previous species had joined the Council through negotiated agreements that included limitations on military expansion and territorial ambitions. Humans had specifically requested membership to gain access to resources for protecting others, not advancing their own interests. Respected Kethavar, human psychology includes powerful protective instincts that extend to any group they consider part of their community. Their history shows they fight most effectively when defending others, not when pursuing conquest. If they adopt Council civilization as part of their protective group, they would represent our most dedicated defenders. But what if they decide Council policies threaten their protective objectives? Pressed Kethavar, what if they determine that Council member species need protection from Council authority itself? The scenario was theoretically possible and terrifying to consider. Humans who decided galactic government was oppressing primitive species might resist with the same intensity they had shown against Keldan raiders. No military force in galactic history had faced opponents psychologically incapable of accepting defeat. Honored Assembly, Zethkar replied carefully, that risk exists with any militarily capable species. However, human psychology suggests they would attempt to change policies through legal processes before resorting to violence. Their protective instincts prioritize minimal harm to innocents, which would include Council civilian populations. The debate continued for hours as Assembly members struggled to understand the implications of human psychology. Some species argued for immediate full membership based on their demonstrated military effectiveness. Others wanted extended probationary periods with strict monitoring of human military development. The most telling moment came when Council member Lithra, whose peaceful species had never engaged in warfare, asked a simple question. Commander, do you believe humans would fight to protect our species if we were threatened? Honored Lithra, I believe humans would fight to protect any species they perceived as needing protection, regardless of whether that species could reciprocate or provide any benefit to humanity. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated this assessment. Most galactic alliances were based on mutual benefit or shared interests. The concept of a species that would fight for others without expectation of return was unprecedented in Council history. Speaker Velnash's harmonic pattern indicated formal decision-making mode. The Assembly will now vote on human membership status. 3 options are available: full membership with standard privileges and responsibilities, probationary membership with enhanced monitoring, or membership denial with continued observation. The voting process revealed deep divisions among Council species. Military-oriented civilizations generally supported full membership, recognizing human combat effectiveness as an asset for galactic defense. Peaceful species were divided between fear of human aggression and appreciation for their protective instincts. Scientific and commercial species worried about disruption to established diplomatic patterns. When the final vote was tallied, humans had been granted probationary membership by a narrow margin. They would receive access to basic galactic technology and communication networks, but their military activities would be closely monitored for 5 years before full membership consideration. Zethkar felt mixed satisfaction with the result. Humans had achieved their primary objective, access to resources necessary for protecting primitive worlds from raider attacks. But the probationary restrictions would limit their effectiveness and likely frustrate their protective instincts. As the Assembly dispersed, several members approached Zethkar privately to discuss human capabilities in more detail. The conversations revealed that his official report had only scratched the surface of galactic interest in human psychology. Council member Thrixon summarized the broader concern. Commander, we have spent millennia developing galactic civilization based on rational self-interest and mutual benefit. Humans represent something completely different. a species motivated by objectives beyond their own survival or advancement. Whether that makes them our greatest allies or our greatest threat remains to be determined. Zethkar knew the assessment period would be crucial for both humans and galactic civilization. The next 5 years would determine whether human protective instincts could be channeled toward preserving galactic peace, or whether their psychological traits would prove incompatible with established diplomatic norms. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same. The age of predictable limited warfare based on rational cost-benefit analysis was ending. 5 years after human probationary membership began, Zethkar stood in the same assembly chamber where he had first testified about human psychology. The chamber looked identical, but everything else had changed. The galaxy itself had been transformed by human influence in ways no one could have predicted. The transformation had begun immediately after humans gained access to galactic technology. Within months, they had reverse-engineered faster-than-light communication systems and began establishing contact with primitive civilizations throughout the galaxy. Their first priority wasn't trade or diplomacy. It was warning other species about raider threats and offering protection. Human space forces had expanded with unprecedented speed. They didn't build massive battleships or establish territorial claims like other species. Instead, they created small, fast patrol vessels designed specifically for rapid response to distress calls from primitive worlds. Their entire fleet doctrine focused on protecting others rather than projecting power. The results had been staggering. Raider attacks on primitive worlds had dropped by 90% in the 5 years since human patrols began. The few raider groups that still operated avoided any system where human ships might respond. The mere possibility of facing opponents who fought without regard for casualties had proved an effective deterrent. But human influence extended far beyond military operations. Their protective instincts had influenced galactic culture in unexpected ways. Other species had begun adopting human concepts like emergency response teams, disaster relief operations, and protection of endangered civilizations. Zethkar's role had evolved during the probationary period. Instead of observing human military operations, he had been assigned to coordinate council oversight of human activities. The assignment had given him unprecedented insight into how human psychology affected galactic civilization. The most significant change was in how other species approached conflict resolution. Before human membership, galactic disputes were typically resolved through negotiated settlements based on mutual self-interest. Humans introduced the concept of fighting for principles beyond material gain, which had complicated traditional diplomatic processes. 3 major conflicts during the probationary period had demonstrated human impact on galactic military doctrine. In each case, humans had volunteered to defend species that couldn't reciprocate their assistance. Their willingness to accept casualties for abstract principles had forced other council members to reconsider their own military commitments. The first conflict involved Zeldin, raiders threatening the Gorth homeworld. Traditional council response would have involved diplomatic protests and economic sanctions that might eventually deter the attacks. Humans immediately dispatched patrol vessels and engaged Zeldin forces directly, eliminating the threat within days. The second conflict was more complex. The Nexari Empire had begun systematically enslaving primitive species in their territorial region, claiming they were providing civilization to backward cultures. Council species were divided on whether this constituted illegal raiding or legitimate territorial expansion. Humans declared Nexari activities unacceptable regardless of legal technicalities. They established patrol routes through Nexari territory and began liberating enslaved populations. When Nexari forces attempted to stop these operations, humans fought a 3-month campaign that ended with complete Nexari withdrawal from all primitive worlds. The third conflict had tested human psychology most severely. The Kithara Collective, a machine intelligence that had achieved spaceflight, began converting organic species into cybernetic drones to expand their computational capacity. They specifically targeted primitive worlds where resistance would be minimal. Human response was immediate and devastating. They declared the Kithara Collective an existential threat to all organic life and began systematic elimination of collective installations. The campaign lasted 18 months and ended with complete destruction of collective infrastructure throughout 3-star systems. What disturbed Other council species wasn't human military. Effectiveness, it was their complete commitment to objectives beyond rational self-interest. Humans had accepted massive casualties to protect species they had never met, fighting with intensity that bordered on terrifying. Now, 5 years later, Zethkar was preparing to deliver his final assessment of human probationary membership. The debate would determine whether humans achieved full council status or faced restrictions that might limit their protective activities. Speaker Velnash opened the session with familiar harmonic protocols. Commander Zethkar, please provide your final assessment of human performance during probationary membership. Honored Assembly, human activities during the probationary period have exceeded all initial projections. They have eliminated raider threats throughout their assigned patrol sectors, established peaceful contact with 47 primitive civilizations, and provided emergency assistance to 12 council member species during natural disasters. The statistics were impressive, but Zethkar knew Assembly members were more concerned about human psychological traits than operational achievements. Several species had expressed growing unease about human commitment to objectives beyond rational calculation. Commander, interrupted Council Member Thrickson, human military operations have consistently exceeded authorized parameters. They have engaged hostile forces without Council approval, established relationships with non-member species without diplomatic oversight, and committed resources beyond rational cost-benefit calculations. How do we control a species that ignores standard operational limitations? The question reflected fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology that persisted despite 5 years of observation. Respected Thrickson, humans don't ignore operational limitations, they prioritize different objectives than other species. Their primary goal is protecting others from harm, which sometimes requires immediate action that doesn't allow time for formal approval processes. But that's exactly the problem, pressed Council Member Kethvar. Humans make strategic decisions based on emotional responses rather than logical analysis. They cannot be integrated into standard command structures because they refuse to accept orders that conflict with their protective instincts. Zethkar had anticipated this concern. Honored Kethavar, human refusal to accept certain orders has actually improved operational outcomes. During the Nexari conflict, human commanders identified civilian populations that Council intelligence had missed. Their insistence on protecting those populations prevented what would have been significant diplomatic disasters. The debate continued for hours as Assembly members struggled with the same fundamental question that had dominated human probationary membership. How do you integrate a species whose primary motivation transcends rational self-interest? The answer came from an unexpected source. Council Member Lithra, whose peaceful species had initially supported human membership, made an observation that reframed the entire discussion. Honored Assembly, we have spent 5 years trying to understand how to control human activities. Perhaps we should instead ask how to learn from them. Every species in this chamber pursues objectives based on benefit to our own populations. Humans pursue objectives based on benefit to all populations. Which approach better serves the stated ideals of galactic civilization? The question forced Assembly members to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Galactic Council had been established to promote peace and cooperation among intelligent species, but most member activities were motivated by self-interest rather than collective benefit. Humans represented the first species whose actions consistently prioritized collective welfare over individual advancement. Speaker Velnash's harmonic pattern shifted to formal decision mode. The Assembly will vote on human membership status. 2 options remain: full membership with standard privileges and responsibilities, or continued probationary status with enhanced integration requirements. The voting process revealed how dramatically galactic attitudes had changed during the probationary period. Species that had initially opposed human membership now supported them based on demonstrated results. Even militaristic species had recognized that human protective activities served their own security interests. When the final vote was tallied, humans had achieved full council membership by overwhelming majority. Only 3 species voted for continued probationary status, and those were based on procedural concerns rather than opposition to human activities. As the Assembly dispersed, Zethkar reflected on how completely his own understanding had changed since beginning observations of human warfare. He had initially seen humans as dangerous anomalies whose psychological traits threatened galactic stability. Now he understood they represented evolution of galactic civilization toward principles that transcended individual species' interests. The transformation wasn't complete. Many council species still struggled to understand human motivations or integrate their protective activities into established diplomatic frameworks. But the fundamental shift had begun from civilization based on mutual self-interest to civilization based on collective responsibility for protecting all intelligent life. Human membership represented more than adding another species to the council. It marked the beginning of true galactic commune,